Hello, I'm Elise Vance, the author of the channel Borrowed Lives, and I offer you fascinating stories. Like and subscribe to my channel.
The night my husband brought his lover into our home, the air in Atlanta was heavy with a relentless summer deluge. It was exactly 9:14 p.m. I know this because the digital clock on the oven flashed red just as Julian stepped through the foyer, the torrential rain drumming violently against the glass panes. Behind him stood a woman. At first, I rationalized it. Julian owned a boutique architectural woodshop, and wealthy clients frequently demanded late-night consultations. But then I noticed her pristine silver luggage and the quiet, proprietary smirk on her face. She wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was. Julian didn't look at me as he kicked off his mud-caked boots onto the hardwood I had polished just hours before. "Clara," he said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "We need to reevaluate things." That single phrase turns 20 years of shared history into ash. In the dining room, our 10-year-old daughter, Lily, sat at the table, her battered velvet sketchpad gripped tightly against her chest. The woman stepped forward, extending a hand tipped with flawless French manicures. "Hi, I'm Vanessa." She looked barely 30, radiating the glossy, manicured perfection of a curated lifestyle blog. Then came the blow that fractured my world. Vanessa is moving into the master's suite for the time being. Before my brain could process the absurdity, a voice drifted from the parlor. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, walked in holding 2 crystal flutes of champagne. She handed one to Vanessa. This wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment, it was a coup. "Clara, darling, let's not be uncivilized," Beatrice murmured, crossing her arms. "You brought her here?" "With Lily in the next room," I whispered, my voice trembling. Julian exhaled, irritated. "Don't start the theatrics. The company is facing a massive audit, and Vanessa is a primary investor now. Besides, this estate belongs to my family trust. If you plan on causing a scene, the detached carriage house over the garage is empty. You and Lily can sleep out there tonight." I looked at Beatrice, expecting a shred of maternal decency. Instead, she stared dead into my eyes and nodded in agreement. In that precise moment, the house stopped being a home. It was just a cage. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I walked straight upstairs, grabbed heavy-duty black trash bags from the pantry, and began shoving my clothes inside. My hands shook so violently I could barely tie the plastic knots. Lily sat on the edge of the guest bed, her eyes wide with terror. "Mom, where are we going?" "Somewhere safe, sweetheart," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "We carried our lives downstairs in plastic bags." Julian looked mildly startled. He had expected tears and negotiations, not a silent exit. As the heavy mahogany front door slammed shut behind us, we stepped into the blinding downpour. I drove blindly into the dark, heading east toward the South Carolina coast. Lily fell asleep against the passenger window, clutching her sketchpad. Near the state line, the weight of the betrayal finally crushed me, and I had to pull over at a deserted rest stop just to breathe. I hadn't just lost a husband. I realized I had spent 2 decades shrinking myself for a man who could discard his family without blinking. It was just past 1:30 a.m. when I pulled into the gravel driveway of my mother's coastal cottage in Beaufort. The salt air hung thick in the mist. The porch light was burning bright. My mother, Eleanor, stood at the door in her linen robe. She took one look at the trash bags in my hands, and the exhaustion etched into my face. She didn't ask for explanations. She simply opened the door wider. "Bring the child inside," she said firmly. "The kitchen is warm." Inside, the cottage smelled of lavender and steeped Earl Grey tea, unchanged since my childhood. Lily sat quietly at the worn oak table while my mother ladled warm vegetable broth into a vintage ceramic bowl. Her sharp eyes lingered on the black plastic bags resting by the door, then flicked to my bare, trembling hands. "So," Eleanor said, taking a slow sip from her mug once Lily had drifted off to sleep on the sunroom daybed. "Tell me exactly how that arrogant boy managed to ruin himself." "The dam broke." I wept, not a quiet, cinematic cry, but the guttural, exhausting sob of a woman who had spent years holding up a collapsing roof. Between gasps, I told her about Vanessa, Beatrice's calculated betrayal, and the humiliating exile to the carriage house. Eleanor listened in absolute silence. Her expression didn't shift until I mentioned that Julian's custom woodshop had been drowning in financial liabilities for nearly 18 months. "What kind of liabilities, Clara?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. "I don't know," I admitted, wiping my face with a dish towel she pressed into my hands. "He always told me the financials were too complex for me. He handled all the banking." Eleanor stared at me, her gaze piercing. "Clara, think carefully. Did you sign anything for him recently?" A cold dread flooded my stomach. There had been dozens of documents brought home late at night over the last few years: business restructuring forms, pandemic relief applications, lines of credit. Whenever I questioned them, Julian would sigh dramatically and ask if I lacked faith in his ability to provide. "Don't embarrass me in front of the board, Clara. Just sign it." I had conflated blind trust with marital loyalty. "Oh, you poor girl," Eleanor murmured softly. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Arthur Vance was sitting at our kitchen table. Arthur was a retired corporate litigator, a lifelong friend of my late father, who permanently smelled of peppermint drops and old leather books. For 2 hours, he methodically flipped through the digital copies of tax returns and loan agreements I managed to pull from my email. "Did he explain the exposure here?" Arthur asked, tapping a finger against a commercial credit line. "He said it was standard corporate debt," I whispered. Arthur removed his reading glasses, looking at me with profound pity. "It's a cross-collateralized personal guarantee. If Julian's firm goes under, and looking at these numbers, it's a sinking ship, the creditors can seize your personal assets, your savings, everything tied to your name." The room spun. But Arthur wasn't finished. He pointed to a series of recent wire transfers routing funds out of the primary business account into a newly formed LLC registered in Savannah. The sole manager listed on the documentation was Vanessa. "He isn't just bringing a partner home," Eleanor observed, her face turning to stone. "He's draining the marital estate before filing for divorce." "It appears that way," Arthur agreed grimly. Later that afternoon, Lily wandered into the kitchen, wearing one of my mother's oversized linen shirts. She looked smaller, her usual vibrance dimmed by the shadow of what she had witnessed. "Grandma? Can we go look at the tide pools later?" Eleanor's stern face softened instantly. "Of course we can, my sweet girl." As Lily turned to leave, she noticed my phone buzzing on the counter with a barrage of angry texts from Julian, accusing me of sabotaging his reputation among our old social circle. Before I could reach for it, Lily gently took the device, swiped the screen, and deleted my social media apps. "Why did you do that, honey?" I asked, startled. She looked at me with an old, weary wisdom. "So you stop looking at the pictures of them. They don't deserve to make you cry anymore." 3 weeks after arriving in Beaufort, Eleanor handed me a heavy canvas apron and pointed toward the kitchen counter. I was sitting in her sunroom, wrapped in a faded cardigan, staring out at the salt marshes as if waiting for a ghost. "I'm mourning my life, Mom," I said quietly. "You're hiding from it," Eleanor countered, her tone crisp. "Mourning has a purpose. Staring at the marsh doesn't pay Arthur's retainer fee." That was my mother, pragmatic to a fault. I needed an independent income immediately, not just for the legal battle, but to prove to myself that I existed outside of Julian's shadow. The next Monday, I started working the early shift at a sprawling, hyper-popular regional travel center and bakery off Interstate 95. It was a massive, brightly lit oasis that hummed with tourists, truckers, and the intoxicating scent of freshly smoked brisket and warm pastries at 5 a.m. My new reality consisted of a hairnet, non-slip shoes, and rolling out hundreds of artisanal pecan sticky buns before the sun even hit the highway. The first morning, I locked myself in the employee restroom and wept silently under the harsh fluorescent lights, wondering how a 20-year marriage could end in a commercial bakery. A sharp knock broke my spiral. A woman named Marin stepped in, holding a clipboard. Marin was 60, a veteran of the service industry, sported permanently tattooed eyeliner from the late 90s, and took her breaks in the gravel lot smoking thin cigarettes. She looked at my blotchy face. "You quite finished?" I wiped my eyes, embarrassed. "I think so." "Good," Marin said, handing me a clean towel. Try not to get tears in the glaze. The tourists complain if it's too salty. That blunt honesty was exactly what saved me. Over the next month, the women in that bakery slowly pieced my dignity back together. There was Marin, who had survived 2 divorces, Sandra, whose husband had left her for a younger tennis instructor, and Maeve, who believed any crisis could be solved with extra butter. One morning, as we prepped dough in the quiet dawn, Sandra looked over. So, what did the bastard actually do? I kept my eyes on the rolling pin. He moved his new mistress into our house. Told me I could sleep in the garage apartment. The kitchen went dead silent. Marin stopped mid-motion. Well, she drawled, that is a level of audacity usually reserved for feral raccoons and politicians. The entire kitchen erupted into laughter, and for the first time in months, I joined in. It wasn't a bitter laugh. It was the sound of a woman realizing she was still alive. Meanwhile, Julian's new life was playing out like a public train wreck on social media. Friends sent screenshots of Vanessa's posts, sunlit selfies in my old breakfast nook, captions about manifesting positive energy while holding my grandmother's vintage crystal wine glasses. One caption read, "Some women are anchors, others are sails. Upgrade your life." Marin snorted when I showed her during our lunch break. Honey, a woman who has to post a manifesto to prove she one hasn't upgraded. She's just renting a disaster on layaway. But beneath the humor, the legal pressure was mounting. Julian began calling, his voice stripped of the smug arrogance he had displayed on that rainy night. He accused me of ruining his reputation in Atlanta. I didn't do anything but leave, Julian, I said calmly, standing on my mother's porch. You're making me look like a monster to the investors, he hissed. You brought a stranger into our home while your daughter watched, I replied. I'm just letting the truth do the talking. By mid-autumn, the coastal marshes had shifted to a deep amber, and the blistering humidity finally gave way to a crisp breeze. My days settled into a grueling but comforting rhythm, early mornings spent covered in flour at the bakery, and late afternoons reviewing financial printouts with Arthur at my mother's dining table. Then, my former mother-in-law called. I let it ring 3 times before picking up. I was standing in the aisle of a local market, holding a carton of milk. Beatrice's voice was smooth, syrupy, and entirely devoid of shame. Clara, dear, she began, as if we were merely scheduling a lunch date. I am calling to let you know that Julian's firm is hosting the annual High Museum Charity Gala next month. It is a very high-profile event for his new investors. I waited, saying nothing. Well, she continued, her tone sharpening slightly. People in the Atlanta circle are gossiping. I think it would be vastly more dignified for everyone involved if you kept your distance from the city that weekend. A strange thing happened inside me. I didn't get angry. I actually smiled. After everything they had done, Beatrice still believed that maintaining a polished facade was more important than basic human decency. Beatrice, I said evenly, if your son's choices embarrass you in front of your friends, that sounds like a family crisis. Not my problem. Then I hung up. That evening, Eleanor listened to the exchange while we prepared dinner. Lily was at the far end of the counter, completely absorbed in her homework. My mother didn't even look up from the vegetables she was chopping. We're going, Eleanor stated flatly. I stared at her. To the gala? Mom, absolutely not. I don't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me stand there like a victim. Eleanor set her knife down and looked me dead in the eye. Clara, you have worked tirelessly, protected your daughter, survived a betrayal that would have broken most women, and built a new life from nothing. You are not the embarrassment. The people pretending that infidelity is a corporate asset are the embarrassment. Lily looked up from her notebook. What's an asset, Grandma? Something valuable that you own, sweetheart, Eleanor answered softly, before casting a meaningful glance back at me. And it's time your mother collects hers. 2 days later, Arthur Vance arrived at the cottage carrying a legal folder thick enough to stop a bullet. He dropped it onto the table with a triumphant thud. Well, Arthur announced, a slow grin spreading across his face. Your soon-to-be ex-husband might officially be the most careless businessman in the state of Georgia. He thought he was being clever by funneling company assets into Vanessa's LLC, but he left a blatant paper trail. Arthur had already prepared formal fraud and asset shielding notices, sending certified copies directly to Julian's primary lenders, his accountant, and, most importantly, several key members of the charity's board of directors. In Southern high society, financial scandal at a high-profile fundraiser is considered an unforgivable sin. There is nothing wealthy donors despise more than legal drama near the seafood tower. The night of the gala, I stood in my mother's guest room staring at the mirror. I wore a simple, tailored navy dress and Eleanor's pearl earrings. Nothing flashy, just clean lines. Lily walked into the room, wearing a pretty lace dress my mother had bought her. "You look beautiful, Mom," she whispered. For months, my daughter had seen me broken, weeping over bank statements, and exhausted from bakery shifts. Seeing her look at me now with pride instead of fear was the only validation I needed. When we arrived at the grand ballroom in Atlanta, the air was thick with perfume, clinking crystal, and whispered judgments. The moment we stepped through the threshold, a hush seemed to ripple through the immediate crowd. I spotted Julian near the champagne bar. He looked older, the kind of aging caused by mounting stress and sleepless nights. Vanessa stood beside him in a dramatic scarlet gown, holding a glass with practiced elegance. Beatrice was nearby, plastering on the desperate smile of a woman trying to hold a shattering glass ornament together with sheer willpower. Julian noticed me first. His entire body locked up. Vanessa turned a second later, a flash of absolute panic crossing her face before she forced her glossy smirk back into place. "Well, Clara," Vanessa said loudly as we approached. "You look comfortable." I gave her a polite, cold smile. "And you look incredibly expensive, Vanessa." I just hope Julian checked the return policy. Arthur, standing right beside me, cleared his throat loudly to conceal a laugh. Julian looked entirely overwhelmed. "Clara, can we please not do this here?" Before I could answer, a tall, gray-haired man stepped forward from the inner circle. It was Harrison Vance, no relation to Arthur, but one of the primary venture capitalists Julian had been courting for months. "Julian," Harrison said, his voice dropping like an anvil. "I received a very troubling legal brief from a firm in Beaufort this afternoon regarding your corporate solvency." The surrounding conversation died instantly. Julian tried to laugh it off. "Harrison, please, tonight is a celebration. Let's discuss it in the office Monday." "I don't think so," Harrison replied coldly. "Especially since my foundation's name is tied to this event. Is it true that you are facing active litigation for fraudulent transfer of marital assets?" Nobody spoke. Vanessa gripped Julian's arm tightly, her eyes darting around the room as the wealthy guests began to noticeably back away from them. Julian looked at me, desperate, pleading. "Clara, let's talk privately. For the sake of the past. 20 years of marriage don't vanish instantly." For a split second, an old instinct flared up, the urge to smooth things over, to protect him from public ruin. But then I looked down at Lily, who was holding my hand tightly, and the memory of that rainy night in the kitchen settled heavily into my bones. "You spent years making me feel small so you could feel powerful, Julian," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly across the silent circle. "I'm just finally standing at my full height." The fallout from that night wasn't an explosion. It was an evaporation. Within days of the gala, Harrison Vance and 2 other major investors officially pulled their funding from Julian's design firm. In the tight-knit business community of Atlanta, a reputational stain travels faster than a summer storm. By the time winter arrived, bringing a sharp, clean chill that blanketed the Beaufort salt marshes in morning frost, Julian's grand empire had completely fractured. The sprawling family estate in the suburbs was placed on the market to satisfy mounting creditors. According to Arthur, Vanessa didn't stick around to witness the final asset liquidations. The moment the capital dried up, she packed her designer bags, cleared out a high-end stereo system Julian had financed for her, and vanished back across the state line. One evening, while I was sitting at the kitchen counter mapping out wholesale orders for the bakery, the home phone rang. It was Beatrice. I almost didn't answer, but I found I no longer feared the sound of her voice. When I picked up, the venom and arrogance were entirely gone. She sounded frail, like an old woman realizing the foundation she built her life on was made of sand. Clara, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. I wanted to say that things went too far. Lily shouldn't have been subjected to that night. None of it should have happened. It was a clumsy, desperate attempt at absolution. I sat there listening to the steady hum of my mother's refrigerator, looking at the flour dust on my apron. Thank you for saying that, Beatrice, I replied quietly. I hope you all find some peace. And then, without anger, I hung up. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt finished. Hating them required a budget of emotional energy that I was no longer willing to pay. My independent baking venture slowly began to outgrow the travel center. With my mother's encouragement, I transitioned to supplying local boutiques and coastal coffee shops along the waterfront. One brisk January morning, the owner of a popular downtown cafe handed me a check for the week's delivery of pastries. You know, Clara, she said, leaning against the counter, people come in early specifically for your recipe. They say it tastes like home. I smiled, wiping down my delivery crate. It's just real ingredients. No, she countered gently. It's safety. People can taste when something is made by hands that aren't shaking anymore. That phrase stayed with me all the way back to the cottage. For years, I believed security was something given to me by a marriage certificate, a wealthy zip code, and a husband's approval. But standing in the sharp coastal sun at 48 years old, I realized true security is simply the absence of fear. The healing didn't happen in a grand, cinematic epiphany. It came in tiny, silent victories. It was the first morning I woke up at 4:30 a.m. without a pit of dread in my stomach. It was the first month I paid my own health insurance. It was the sight of Lily coming home from school, laughing with the neighbors, her posture relaxed and free of the tension she had carried for years. A few days after the new year, I was washing the breakfast dishes when I noticed my heavy platinum wedding band sitting in a small seashell by the sink. I had taken it off months ago, but it had remained there, a quiet relic of a past life. I picked it up, placed it into a small brown envelope, and sealed it. On the front, I wrote, "Finished." Lily walked into the kitchen a moment later, her sketch pad tucked under her arm. She looked at the envelope, then up at my face, her eyes clear and perceptive. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" I pulled her close, burying my face in her hair, which smelled of ocean air and wind. "No, sweetheart," I said, and for the first time in my life, I meant every single word. "We aren't just going to be okay. We are finally honest. And that is so much better."